The wrestling media is a cesspool of tabloid garbage, and I'm sure you see it every day. If you know anything about any of these stories, you can immediately tell that these headlines are by and large sensationalized clickbait. None of those are reporting in any traditional sense. They're speculation dressed up as urgency, and this is the dominant form that wrestling journalism takes today. Wrestling journalism, though, has a real history of actual reporters breaking actual news about an industry that spent decades trying to make sure nobody could verify anything about it. And that's always been my thought. How do you do journalism on something that is predetermined and kayfabe compliant unless you talk about the business of it? And should we even be reporting on the business of it, or should we just turn our brains off and have fun, like WWE's chief content officer wants us to do? So to talk about all that, I'm going to walk you through how wrestling journalism got built, what made it gain traction, how it grew into a huge ecosystem of podcasts and YouTube channels and insider media run by wrestlers themselves, and how it keeps collapsing into pure clickbait fodder throughout its lifetime. Before we get going here, though, I'm curious, what sites do you visit or what podcasts do you listen to for your wrestling content? Let me know in the comments. Okay, so wrestling is the only major entertainment product in the world that spent a long time insisting it was a real competitive sport, while every single outcome was actually decided in advance. I know we can go back and forth on the real word or not, but the fact is that it is predetermined. That's not how we cover movies, though. Nobody writes a news article asking whether Tom Cruise is getting a push and surviving Mission Impossible 8 or whatever. That's not how we cover other live sports either. The entire apparatus of sports journalism exists to analyze and report on something that, for the most part, you can't predict. And wrestling is in its own category. For most of its history, the official position from every promotion was it is quote unquote real. The wrestlers are not characters, the rivalries are real, and the boys kept up kayfabe for decades. So what does journalism even mean in that environment? What's actually reportable, what's actually news, is everything happening behind the scenes. Who's debuting, who's getting released, who hates who's getting paid what. The entire practice of wrestling journalism from its very origin has been about reporting on the iceberg beneath a show that doesn't want you to know that the iceberg exists. Kind of wild. It's almost always been about exposing the business behind the business. But in its first era, wrestling media was magazines like The Wrestling Eye and Wrestling Main Event, newsstand publications aimed at younger fans which covered storylines as if they were genuinely happening before all of our eyes. Those were an extension of kayfabe into print, produced with the cooperation or direct involvement sometimes of the promotions themselves. The actual shift to something real started almost accidentally, with one guy keeping his college friends updated on tape trading. Dave Meltzer, controversial name in the wrestling industry, started an annual poll among wrestling fans that he was close to back in 1980, mostly just to rank things and keep up records. He also started keeping a tape trading list. He'd send along results and news updates with the tapes, mainly because, in his words, he wanted to keep his college friends in the loop on wrestling, since the wrestling magazines at the time were for kids and weren't really covering the business deeply. And of course, you had some wrestling promotions working together, but a lot of these publications were directly from these wrestling promotions that didn't really want you to know that other promotions exist. That habit from Meltzer, though, became the Wrestling Observer newsletter, launched in 1982 officially. It's basically the first dirt sheet. Early issues were written on a typewriter, photocopied, stapled, and mailed to subscribers every 2 or 3 weeks, and it kinda changed everything. This was a rebellion against the entire wrestling industry. Promotions obviously wouldn't acknowledge dirt sheets existed for a long time. Meltzer had to advertise his own newsletter inside the kayfabed wrestling magazines that were supposedly his competition, since there was literally nobody else willing to run his ads. And initially, it got him pushback from inside the business, wrestlers and promoters who saw his newsletter as a threat to the illusion that they built their livelihood on. Makes sense to me. But they read it anyway. Terry Funk said in his autobiography that the moment he saw the Observer, he knew it was going to take off because Meltzer, quote, wrote about the business behind the scenes in a way nobody else did. He described it as a thermometer for how things were actually getting over in different regions. Mick Foley, not far from Terry Funk, also credited Observer coverage of his independent matches with getting him noticed by WCW. Promoter Bill Watts reportedly changed the entire booking directions based on Meltzer's newsletter and what it was saying about fan reaction. And that's a weird paradox of wrestling journalism that we're still in. Dirt sheets were despised publicly and read privately. Vince McMahon reportedly kept copies on his own desk. The people running the illusion were kind of its biggest supporters, but they couldn't say it out loud. Then for most of the 80s and 90s, this kind of reporting required some building. A mailing list, a subscriber base, actual industry sources. It was a very tightly kept relationship-driven thing. The Wrestling Observer had a bunch of competitors pop up like Pro Wrestling Torch, which occupied a real niche because access was hard to get and even harder to verify at the time, hence why anything they said or say can always be taken with a grain of salt. Even to this day, with sites like WrestleVotes, they're not exactly always on the money, but the accuracy is kind of there sometimes. And on that subject, the internet broke that scarcity model though. Forums, early wrestling websites, and eventually blogs meant anyone could publish wrestling news instantly about anything, right or wrong. Being a big old smart mark went from a niche subculture to a full demographic online, and by 2008, even Meltzer's own operation merged with Brian Alvarez's Figure 4 Weekly to become a combined website, which was an acknowledgement that the print industry couldn't compete with the immediacy of the internet anymore. But of course, many sites were just regurgitating Meltzer's reports. But this era still had some gatekeeping. Sites like PW Insider and Figure 4/Observer built reputations. They cultivated sources and had a track record of decent accuracy and had real relationships in the business, supposedly. But the credibility waned over time. All of a sudden, we got tons of wrestling websites popping up with backstage news, blah, 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 exclusive reports, blah, 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 and more about unconfirmed wink, wink, nudge, nudge news. WrestleZone, Wrestling Inc., and others kind of sat right under the Observer, which has also lost a lot of its credibility over the years for Meltzer's lazy, it might happen or it might not happen type forecasts and wishy-washy ways of giving information. And that leads up to social media clickbait, but there's something else I'd like to address first, a really important part of this whole story. The primary criticism of dirt sheets by wrestlers and pro wrestling officials was that it exposed the business. But just like how they ended up reading dirt sheets behind closed doors, wrestlers and people in the industry took one step further and began to just make the news on their own. Sometime in the early 2010s, wrestlers figured out that they didn't need journalists to tell their stories anymore, and that they could just tell them. Steve Austin's podcast and Chris Jericho's Talk is Jericho were the two shows that effectively launched wrestling podcasting into the zeitgeist. Both leaned on something no traditional dirt sheet could ever offer, which was direct access from someone who'd actually been in the business at the highest level, talking to other people who'd also been in the business at the highest level without any journalists or hosts present. Jericho's show became one of the most downloaded podcasts in the world, and that's not just in wrestling, that's on the entire marketplace. Austin's show, recorded at his Broken Skull Ranch, became known for getting real stories and opinions out of wrestlers who hadn't been that open in the past, and they were great. Jim Ross also started podcasting and brought a different angle, which is less shoot interview type stuff and more historical commentary. His show, eventually named Grillin' JR, leaned into long-form reminiscing over his decades of experience in the business, from regional territories to his run as WWE's head of talent relations to his work eventually in AEW. And then came Conrad Thompson. Conrad is a former mortgage broker who started in the wrestling industry by producing a Ric Flair podcast, which kind of snowballed into building an entire network of shows, pairing him as host and co-producer on shows like 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff, What Happened When with Tony Schiavone, and more shows with Bruce Pritchard, Kurt Angle, Jeff Jarrett, Arn Anderson, Jim Ross. There's a ton of these. The format of these shows is just simply to get a wrestling business insider with a lot of stories, have them react to old shows or relive their career week by week, and let Thompson's questions do the journalistic legwork while the insider provides material that no outside reporter could access. Now, if you like the model or you don't, this is one of the most important developments in the entire history of wrestling media because it effectively beat out traditional journalism in a few ways. A reporter has a lot of barriers to get to a wrestler. They got to ask permission, they got to maintain a relationship. Eric Bischoff doesn't have that problem talking about his own life on his own podcast. The Conrad Thompson model essentially turned wrestling's entire inside class into self-publishing primary sources, with a producer helping shape the material into something that was listenable and coherent. Once again, though, wrestling media is weird. This is not really journalism. There's no independent party checking facts or pushing back, but it's also not pure self-promotion either, because these guys are pretty open about their own failures in the business. It's something entirely new. It's stories produced with a journalistic level of polish and production. But then you got guys like Jim Cornette, who represents a completely different lane. He's essentially a critic. His shows, Jim Cornette Experience and Cornette's Drive-Thru, built an entire audience around Cornette's willingness to say, bluntly, and at length, might I add, what he thinks is wrong with modern wrestling. And since Cornette actually booked successful territories and understands traditional wrestling psychology, he's at least credible. Once again, whether you agree with him or not, his show represents a real demand from wrestling fans for super opinionated, critical analysis delivered by someone with some authority. And that demand exists because so much of mainstream wrestling coverage, and we're about to get to this, is clickbait. And then before we move on this, we got another lane here, Chris Van Vliet, who is a professionally trained broadcast journalist who built a full-scale interview operation specifically around wrestling, shooting in an actual studio most of the time with high production value. Van Vliet's show Insight has hosted every wrestler that I can honestly think of, from Paul Heyman to The Undertaker, and that Undertaker interview where Mark Calloway discussed never breaking kayfabe throughout his entire career became one of the most significant wrestling interviews of the 2020s. CVV brings legitimate interviewing craft to a subject that most news outlets treat super unseriously. And that makes him an outlier in this. And then there's a new format that might be the most consequential one for where wrestling media is heading. Former wrestlers running their own YouTube channels. Maven is the cleanest case study here. I don't know if you heard, but Maven actually eliminated The Undertaker at the 2002 Royal Rumble. Maven saw the business at a very particular time in the early 2000s, and in July 2023, Maven launched his YouTube channel. Within about 3 years, it's grown past 900,000 subs, which is a level of reach that dwarfs what most dedicated wrestling news outlets achieve on their own, run by a guy who, by his own description, was a mid-carder at best. But he could talk about backstage politics, he could talk about locker room dynamics and drugs and all that stuff from direct first-hand experience. Devon Dudley and David Otunga are also cited as direct examples of performers building similar channels. You also even have the whole Busted Open thing with Bully Ray, Tommy Dreamer, and all those guys. And then there's The Undertaker, who's arguably the most kayfabe-committed guy in wrestling history, and a man who spent 30 years never publicly breaking character, now sitting for long-form interviews discussing the business on his own 6 Feet Under podcast and traveling around the US and all that stuff too. So what does that all mean for wrestling journalism? That means wrestling journalism is not produced by journalists, but by subjects that journalism used to cover. That's a really unusual media dynamic. And I know the same thing exists with other industries, musicians, celebrities, but here they also have a business to protect in some ways. So with all of that rich, varied, often genuinely interesting media landscape existing, podcasts, insider YouTube channels, legit interview shows, why does the average person's experience of wrestling news online still mean looking through sensationalized headlines? All over social media, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, wherever you go, it always follows you. And that's because the economics of mainstream wrestling news sites are completely different from everything we just talked about. Podcasts and YouTube channels are funded by direct audience relationships, which is subscriptions, ad reads, Patreon support, and more. Sites like Sportskeeda are funded primarily by programmatic advertising tied to search traffic and page views. That difference explains almost everything about why content looks the way it does on both sides. I'm having some flashbacks to my advertising career, but revenue for these sites is typically driven by how many people click a headline and how many page views they get per visit. They're not rewarded on accuracy or insight or the body of the article. They're rewarded on volume, speed, and headlines specifically engineered to get a click, which in practice means leaning hard on speculation, superlatives, and manufactured urgency with some SEO tactics baked in there. This isn't unique to wrestling, of course. This is just the same content farm logic that hit general entertainment and sports media broadly across the 2010s, the BuzzFeed era of online publishing, where SEO and clickbait reshaped how an entire generation of digital outlets wrote headlines, blah, 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 you get it. Wrestling may just be especially vulnerable to it because the sport already runs partly on speculation about what's coming next. You know, who's winning the title, what's the next feud, which blurs almost seamlessly into a clickbait format built around that kind of guesswork, because you're never going to actually get a real answer for that. There's just speculation. And people have noticed the appetite for the Conrad Thompson model, the Maven model, the Van Vliet model, all of it, in part, is a reaction against the tabloid garbage that plays on our emotions, and it still works. So why listen to these websites when you can just go straight to the source all the time? That's because these websites appear everywhere that we are and everywhere that you want to be. And the headlines, even though ridiculous, gets you thinking, gets you talking, gets you commenting. But some of the people that thrive the most off that sensationalized journalism want you to forget about it too. Just gonna add another layer in here. Let's talk about Triple H. In a recent interview with Stephen A. Smith, Triple H made a comment about WWE. Quote, "We're just fun, man. We're fun, and sometimes people take it too seriously. If you just want to turn off your brain for a couple hours and tune into something cool that you can just lose yourself in and have a good time, WWE is the place to do it." This isn't a first-time thing. In an earlier interview with Peter Rosenberg, Triple H was even more direct, saying that he wished he could tell critics to, quote, F off and be a fan. And okay, there's a version of his argument that's totally reasonable to me. Wrestling is meant to be fun. And there is something a little exhausting about modern wrestling online discourse, where every single segment gets torn apart online within minutes for whether it was perfect or not, or whether it helped further the story or make so-and-so look strong heading into backlash. And that sometimes drains the joy out of watching a show. I get that. But the program that people watch is just a part of the pie. When you sit down for a Monday Night Raw or a Friday Night SmackDown or Wednesday Night Dynamite, that's only a few hours of your week. And if you're a wrestling fan with an algorithm like mine, it's just flooded with stuff. 80% of the wrestling content I consume is online, and it's not watching the actual show. It's about hearing about the industry through social media. It's about hearing about backstage news. It's about getting updates, even from the companies themselves. So a lot of these companies are profiting, at least with free advertising, from all of these outlets that spit all these stories out. But if WWE wants its audience emotionally invested enough to pay premium ticket prices, buy merchandise, subscribe to Netflix, subscribe to whatever crazy premium ESPN tier they gotta do, that means those fans are taking it seriously. You can't simultaneously cultivate that level of financial and emotional commitment and then ask people to not care that the show is bad. Turn your brain off and just enjoy it is, in effect, an argument against the entire premise of wrestling journalism existing at all. Not just the bad clickbait stuff, but the Meltzer version, the Cornette stuff, the Maven version, all of it. If the correct way to consume wrestling is passive enjoyment with zero critical thought, then what are we even doing watching it in the first place? I don't think Triple H is wrong that wrestling is fun and that some fans take things too far and overanalyzing everything, and don't even get me started with the AI images. But the fix for clickbait garbage isn't fewer options, it's the audience picking quality sources to consume. So where does that leave us? Wrestling journalism started as an act of rebellion. A few guys with typewriters deciding the audience deserved to know what was actually happening behind a curtain. And it grew into something valuable, real reporting that affected bookings, helped wrestlers understand their audience, and helped propel the industry from kayfabe into realism. I think a lot of this also was a part in the Attitude Era. Then it split into two very different futures. On one side, an ongoing explosion of insider-driven media where people who used to be the subjects of journalism became its primary producers, often with more credibility and more insight than any outside reporter. And then on the other side, a content farm machine optimized purely for clicks that abandoned almost every actual journalistic function in favor of speculation and spinning. And sitting above both of those futures is a billion-dollar entertainment company whose own leadership suggests the healthiest way to consume its product is to not think about it too hard. Which is a strange thing to ask of an audience that you also want to be served wrestling media on a consistent basis, and you want to care enough to keep showing up, keep buying tickets, and keep being emotionally invested in your product. And maybe that's actually the most interesting thing about covering this business at all. The fact that it's predetermined doesn't make the human story behind it any less real, and figuring out where the line is between just enjoy the show and actually understand what you're watching might be the most defining question in wrestling media today, and probably for a long time to come. Anywho, I hope you enjoyed this more like meta conversation about wrestling media, but let me know your thoughts in the comments. Would love to hear it from you directly. Hope you learned something, hope you had fun, and in the meantime, guys, I will catch you.
Ooh, chavo!